Hello everyone, welcome to Soothing Steno, where I'll be writing what I'm reading via my Steno machine. Today's book is To Make Our World Anew, A History of African Americans, edited by Robin D.G. Kelly and Earl Lewis. Slip this book jacket. To Make Our World Anew. Copywritten 2000 by Oxford University Press. Currently, I'm on chapter 7. A Chance to Make Good, 1900 to 1929 by James R. Grossman. In 1900, 90% of all African Americans lived in the South. 3/4 of these 8 million people inhabited rural communities. The 880,771 Black Northerners, on the other hand, were decidedly urban. 71% lived in cities. History and personal experience taught African Americans that their position in U.S. society could not be understood without understanding racism. But race was not the only basis for discrimination in American life, nor was it the only way Americans defined themselves. Class and gender, along with religion, ethnicity, and age, also shaped lives, ideas, and dreams. Perhaps, indeed, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of color line, as W.E.B. Du Bois declared in 1903. But the significance and the composition of that line cannot be reduced to the biology of skin pigmentation. The meaning of race and the practice of racism were tightly intertwined with labor systems, ideas about family life, and assumptions about the relationship between manhood and citizenship. Du Bois recognized that it was impossible to understand the meaning of race without also understanding class. The place of African Americans in society was inseparable from their place in the economy. In African American history, images of victimization spring to mind as readily as notations of progress. Hope has most often bred disappointment and frequently disillusionment as well. In the early 20th century, Black Americans shared in the aspirations and expectations of their fellow citizens, but did so as a people with a unique history and set of barriers to overcome. African Americans argued among themselves as to what those barriers were made of, exactly where they were situated, how permanent they were, and whether they should be destroyed, circumvented, or hurdled. During the first 3 decades of the 20th century, thousands of Black men and women obliterated, removed, tiptoed around, climbed over, and even passed through these barriers. Others ignored them. Some resigned themselves to the limitations and pain these barriers produced, without accepting the notation that such obstacles were natural or just. And still others suffered from the costs of pounding the barriers at times, and in places where they were too deeply embedded in the social fabric to be breached. Making a living. At the dawn of the 20th century, the color line, or the separation between whites and blacks, was most clear and most rigid in the South. With 95% of African Americans living south of the Ohio River and east of Central Texas, this was also where the overwhelming majority of Black people lived. Before the Civil War, the Ohio River and the Mason-Dixon line, separating Pennsylvania from Maryland, had marked the line between slavery and freedom. Even though freedom in the North was limited by employment discrimination, barriers to voting and office holding, and racial segregation. In 1900, 35 years after emancipation, this boundary remained particularly meaningful to African Americans. South of the line, citizenship guaranteed little. To describe the condition of Blacks in the South, both whites and Blacks used the phrase first articulated by the United States Supreme Court in the 1857 case of Dred Scott versus Sanford to limit the scope of African American citizenship before the Civil War. Blacks had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. That was still the case in the South in 1900. In the North, Black men and women enjoyed the same legal rights as whites, but an informal color line set the race apart, limiting where Blacks could work, live, and send their children to school. In the West, patterns somewhat resembled the North. In both regions, African Americans lived mainly in cities. Because the black populations in western states remained small, however, there tended to be greater flexibility and fewer restrictions. Indeed, blacks not only were barely visible in the West, but in many cases attracted less hostility than Asian and Mexican immigrants. Despite these significant variations, however, racism had become part of American national culture. African Americans everywhere were likely to earn less than whites, work longer hours at less desirable jobs, or be unemployed, and confront limitations on where they could go and what they could do. The story of the 20th century begins where the restrictions were the most concrete and wide-ranging, and where most African Americans lived and worked, in the South. As the century opened, 4/5 of all black Southerners lived in rural communities. Most were members of families who earned their living from the land. What they planted depended largely on where they lived. Tobacco remained important in Virginia, North Carolina, and Kentucky. Sugarcane continued to be grown in Louisiana. Though most of the South, cotton still reigned. But whatever they grew and whatever they lived, most African Americans across the South worked, worshipped, rested, and partied around cycles of labor. The long hours required to plant, cultivate, harvest a cash crop. And most operated within a system of land ownership and rental that varied considerably in its details but little in its basic framework. By 1900, approximately 1/4 of all black Southerners who operated farms owned the soil they tilled. The number of black farm owners and their total acreage increased each year. Southern black leaders frequently pointed to these accomplishments as evidence of a strong work ethic among their people and of the great potential that lay in the rural South. But the story was more complicated and less encouraging than the tale told by these statistics. Impressive increases in total acreage owned by black Southerners did testify to hard work and frugality. Many lived according to the work ethic later articulated by Alabama farmer Ned Cobb. I didn't come in this world to rush out. If I need anything done in my field, I ought to be there, if time will admit it, on time. I got to work. I'm born to work. In the opening decade of the 20th century, Cobb clawed his way up the ladder from wage laborer to sharecropper, cash renter, and finally owner. But he was never able to accumulate much, and more than once he was cheated out of his assets by white landowners and merchants. For him, as so many others, prosperity, even more independence, remained a difficult goal to achieve and maintain. These farms were small and seldom grew any larger. Moreover, even farmers who had not borrowed money to purchase their farms still needed some form of credit to meet a year's expenses before their crops could be harvested in the fall. Partly because the land worked by black farms tended to be worth less than the crop they could be grown on it, local merchants and bankers would secure loans by taking a lien on the crop, guaranteeing they would have first rights to the sale of the crop rather than a mortgage on the land. Instead of repossessing the land if a farmer failed to repay, the lender took what was due out of the sale of the crop. The farmer got what was left, and sometimes that was very little. The holder of the lien could, and often did, require that the farmer put most of his field into a cash crop in order to increase the likelihood of the farmer repaying his debt. Families who owned land, thus, had to purchase food that they otherwise might have grown themselves, and often from the same merchant who demanded that, as a condition of their loan, they plant most of their field in cotton or tobacco. With little money to invest and working on land that was less productive than that available to renters, most black farm owners maintained an unstable grip on their independence. 1 or 2 years of bad weather or low prices for their crops could hurl them back into tenancy. The symbolic value of ownership and the extent to which it permitted members of the family to go about their lives without thinking about a white landlord could only multiply the pain of losing one's land. The vast majority of black farmers rented their land, either as cash renters or sharecroppers. Most black tenants were sharecroppers, especially where cotton was the main crop. Because most sharecroppers had no source of money until the end of the year, they had to borrow, either from the landlord or from a local merchant, in order to meet normal family expenses. These loans, often called furnish, would be repaid after settlement. Settlement took place at the end of the year, when the landlord or merchant would compare the value of the tenant's portion of the crop with the sum advanced to the tenant during the preceding 12 months. Almost invariably, the sharecropper came out either behind or barely even. Even the thousands of sharecroppers who were illiterate and therefore unable to challenge the accounting suspected that they seldom received their due. In 1919, for example, George Conway of Keogh, Arkansas, raised 20 bales of cotton worth $3,500. Although he knew that he had not purchased more than $300 worth of merchandise on credit from his landlord that year, he was told at settlement that he still owed $40. He demanded for an itemized accounting earned him only a beating. Still claiming a debt of $40, the landlord seized Conway's household goods and drove him off the plantation. The inevitability of the unfair settlement became a staple of African American humor, with innumerable variations of a joke that was a tenant secretly withholding a bale or two of cotton at settlement time. As William Pickens, whose families sharecropped in South Carolina and Arkansas, later observed, "Who could deny it? The white man did all the reckoning. The Negro did all the work." To complain or to threaten legal action was useless. No court would rule in favor of a black sharecropper against a white landlord. A sharecropper could carry over a debt into the next year, move to another farm with the debt built into the next contract, or quietly try to leave, to skip out on an obligation that most black Southerners considered a complete sham anyway. Indeed, the debt was even worse than a sham. By law, the tenant was actually a wage laborer. The crop belonged to the landlord, but the landlord had it both ways. The sharecropper family worked, yet received no regular wages. They were paid nothing until the crop had been harvested and sold. Thus, the landlord was actually the one who should have been considered the debtor. The cash or wage that was being withheld from the laborer was a debt, cash that the landlord owed the tenant but did not have to pay until December. To satisfy the basic needs of their families, sharecroppers thus had to borrow at high interest rates, generally ranging from 40 to 70% in an era when rates elsewhere generally fluctuated between 4 and 8%. Even at these outrageous prices, sharecroppers could get credit to buy only what the landlord or furnishing merchant deemed appropriate. Those basic needs were quite modest. The standard of living among black sharecroppers in the South was generally lower than that of mid-19th century westward pioneers. But were the pioneers' log cabins suggest to us images of upwardly mobile families clearing homesteads and carving out a living from the land. Sharecroppers' log cabins represent a very different reality. These cabins, which could be constructed out of rough boards rather than logs, were dark, sometimes without windows. Where there were openings, they generally lacked glass panes and often even shutters as well. Screens were virtually unknown. Keeping the house clean, considered to be women's work, was virtually impossible. With only 3 rooms or fewer, it was equally impossible to create specialized spaces for such activities as eating, sleeping, or memorizing one's school lessons. Several members of a family slept in a single room, with 5 or more. Not at all expect divisions between private and public spaces in their homes. The tenant's cabin afforded no such luxury. There was no such thing as a room that had only one purpose or was the domain of a single family member. For many sharecroppers, family life was different from that idealized by a mainstream middle-class family. Black families in the rural South resembled the 2-parent households common elsewhere in the United States at the time, but were more likely to include older relatives as well. Perhaps the presence of their adults left husbands and fathers with less authority than their counterparts elsewhere. Many definitely had to share authority with their landlords, who drew contracts that permitted them to require family members to work the fields. Black men thus came to value their ability to relieve their wives and children of field work. Moreover, by controlling the furnish, a landlord could influence relations within a sharecropper's family by defining the range of purchasing options. How much of each kind of clothing, how many luxuries, or what kind of food. The sharecropper's diet was dull and often sparse. A garden could yield plenty of food, but many landlords required their tenants to grow cotton almost to the door. The Delta Farm Company, owner of 35,000 acres of land in Mount Bayou County, Mississippi, for example, prohibited its tenants from raising anything other than cotton. No chicken or vegetables were permitted. Generally, tenants tended small gardens, supplemented by what they could afford at the local store. The result was a lot of cornmeal and poor cuts of pork, all prepared with generous quantities of animal fat. Another challenge to women, who increasingly were being told by agricultural reformers, black and white, to be better housewives by preparing more healthful food. Indeed, the growing movement for better farming methods and more efficient rural housekeeping bore little relevance to the realities of sharecropping. There was no incentive for tenants or owners to improve either the farm or the dwelling. Landlords were steeped in a culture committed to an agricultural economy based on cheap labor. They also were steeped in a culture which assumed that black people would have difficulty learning advanced farming methods or how to operate and maintain machinery. Landlords considered mules and cabins appropriate to the aptitude and productivity of African Americans. A greater investment in equipment or living conditions, they thought, would neither raise the value of the property nor increase output. Moreover, the landlord would receive only a portion of any increased yield that might result from improvement. On the tenant's side, improving the farm made even less sense. Why invest sweat or money into a home or farm that was owned by someone else? What little cash a family might accumulate was best spent in movable items that could increase one's share of the crop next time around: a wagon, a mule, or a plow. And why accumulate household goods when in all likelihood the family would move within a few years? Little surprise that housekeeping technology seldom went far beyond water pail, wash tub, and cooking kettle. Having no investment in home or farm and encountering constant frustration regardless of how hard they worked, sharecroppers were bound to remain alert to other possibilities. Although many families remained on a single farm for years, William Pickens' parents were more typical. By the time he had reached his 19th birthday in 1900s, he had known more than 20 buildings that he could call home. At first, they moved locally from farm to farm within their rural South Carolina community. Their big chance seemed to strike in the late 1880s when a visitor told them about Arkansas, where planters were clamoring for men to work land being bought under cultivation. The man was a labor agent, one of many recruiters who in the late 19th century traveled through those parts of the South where years of growing cotton or tobacco had worn the land thin. These agents worked for planters further south in Florida or, more frequently, further west in the Mississippi Delta or in Arkansas. With no prospects in South Carolina, Pickens' parents were prepared to listen. The agent said that Arkansas was a tropical country of soft and balmy air where coconuts, oranges, lemons, and bananas grew. Ordinary things like corn and cotton, with little cultivation, grew at enormous yield. So they went. During the last 2 decades of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th, the system stabilized, but most people moved. The South's black population churned as rural people moved from plantation to plantation, county to county, state to state, in quest of the holy grail of land ownership. Some, like the Pickens, were lured by labor agents. Others, especially in hilly areas where whites already outnumbered blacks, were pushed out in a process known as white caping, a term that referred to the practice of night riders pushing African Americans off their land through threat of violence. At least 239 instances of white caping were recorded during the 2 decades beginning in the late 1880s, with Mississippi the most common site. The term seems to have originated in Indiana, where night riders invading a small community or threatening an individual African American resident would wear white caps as part of their disguise. Despite its origins in the Midwest, white caping was mainly a southern rural phenomenon. Successful black farmers were the most likely target of this kind of eviction because of the common assumption among whites that the success of some blacks might unleash realistic and dangerous aspirations among the local black population. A farmer in Alpharetta, Georgia, recognized that he better not accumulate much, no matter how hard and honest you work for it, as you can't enjoy it. In some cases, whole communities were forced from their homes. In areas more heavily populated by African Americans, especially the Black Belt, stretching from the cotton growing region of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and East Texas, nature took its toll as well. The boll weevil, which devoured cotton, entered the United States from Mexico towards the end of the 19th century. Some landlords responded by diversifying their farms, especially after 1910, when the weevil's impact interacted with a growing agricultural reform movement. Corn required only 1/5 as much labor as cotton, which meant that many black tenants and wage hands were suddenly thrown out of work. In other cases, black farmers confronted with a weevil-infested crop headed for areas rumored to be untouched or abandoned farming altogether. This constant movement vexed landlords, but it was virtually built into the system. Indeed, contrary to conventional options among whites, the proclivity to move had little to do with what whites called Negro character. Black Southerners did move more frequently than whites, but mainly because they were more likely to be sharecroppers, the most mobile category of farmers. Among all sharecroppers in the early 20th century South, African Americans had the lowest rates of mobility. Black cash renters and owners were each more stable than their white counterparts. Moving was in fact the American way. The movement of labor towards opportunity is essential to the efficient operation of labor markets in a growing economy. Free labor implies the ability of workers to move from depressed locales to areas of expansion, liberating both the worker to take advantage of opportunity and the employer from any responsibility for supporting former employees. But the rural South, especially where cotton or sugar cultivation dominated patterns of employment, was committed to a different type of economy, one dominated by the plantation, a form of production that required a tightly controlled labor force. Except in areas where new lands were being brought into cultivation, a stable labor force seemed essential to both the prosperity of individual landowners and the stability of the system itself. Complaints about a chaotic labor market and restless and unreliable black labor abounded. White landowners lamented the inclination of their tenants to be controlled far more by their fancies than by their common sense. In response, nearly all southern states and many localities as well attempted to immobilize black labor by erecting legal and economic barriers to movement. Although enmeshed in a capitalist economy based on the ability of the employer to purchase and control only the labor of workers and not the workers themselves, Southern landlords insisted on their right to limit the ability of people they called their Negroes to change employers. Control over land and credit proved the basis for one set of barriers to mobility. Many landowners limited the amount of land they would rent to each tenant in order to ensure that the sharecropper would cultivate the land intensively. Moreover, tenants with small plots were less likely to earn enough to permit them to advance into the ranks of landowners. The goal was to keep Black Southerners as dependent as possible on white landowners and merchants. Where the sharecroppers was not dependent, he could be tied down by contract. In most southern states, a sharecropping contract differed from most other contracts in that it was enforceable in criminal rather than civil courts. A sharecropper who skipped out after planting a crop would not be sued. He was not likely to have any assets anyway, but arraigned on criminal charges. What really mattered, however, was not whether a tenant remained on a particular farm so much as whether a locality's total labor force remained stable. Local movement was expected and tolerated. Indeed, local movement provided frustrated and discontented tenants with an apparent choice of options, a reason to hope that a new chance might yield a better crop and brighter future. What was crucial was to limit the threat to the local labor supply to ensure that, come picking time, there would be enough Black men, women, and children to drag heavy sacks through the field. Assuming incorrectly that the long-distance movement was largely the result of smooth-tongued recruiters, Southern landlords and employers went to considerable lengths to curb labor agent menace. States and localities across the South put considerable efforts into keeping their Negroes ignorant of outside opportunities. In 1900s, the United States Supreme Court for the first time upheld the constitutionality of the laws requiring labor agents to pay licensing fees that were so high as to make it impossible to legally entice away a community's Black workers. A flood of legislation followed as state and local governments determined to protect their labor force from recruiters. Recruitment laws had little effect, however. They were extremely difficult to enforce. Even more important, they ignored the influence of informal networks across the Black South that carried information and misinformation about opportunities in developing sections of the region. What really kept Black Southerners in place kept them not in particular communities, but in the regional economy as a whole. There were few alternatives, at least for men, beyond seasonal farm work. As for PD Watchman, a South Carolina Black newspaper, explained in 1917, since the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s, thousands desired to leave but could not find no haven, no place where the demand for Negro labor was greater than the supply. Moreover, within the rural economy, opportunities existed for employment during the black season. A cotton crop requires spurts of intense activity, preparing the field, planting, hoeing, and harvesting, punctuated by intervals of monitoring. These intervals permitted family members who did not have primary responsibility for a crop to seek other employment. Turpentine camps, sawmills, cottonseed oil mills, and other industries tied to the rural economy provided young men with opportunities to earn wages. Young women ventured into cities and towns to earn extra cash, washing, cooking, or cleaning. In most cases, these individuals moved back and forth between town, or less frequently city, and farm, with the largest interval coming after picking in the late fall and before planting time in March. Leaving the countryside permanently, however, was a more daunting matter, especially for men. The new expanding industries of the early 20th century South offered few opportunities to black workers of southern cities and southern factories. Each was interested only in white people and machine tenders. Skilled positions in such new urban sectors as electrical production and streetcar transportation remained equally off limits, while at the same time, white workers were displacing blacks from 19th century footholds in the skilled construction trades. Black men could find jobs in coal mines and in the iron and steel mills in the area of Birmingham, Alabama, but these represented exceptions to the general pattern of casual employment known as Negro labor. The urban economy thus meshed effectively with the rural. The plantation needed a stable labor force that could find outlets during slack periods. Town and city employers looked to black workers to fill temporary needs, usually involving a shovel or a broom. Thanks for joining with me. See you soon.